Everyone in the Moretti mansion believed Vincent Moretti had lost the use of his legs, but Grace Carter saw something far more dangerous than a broken man. She saw the woman beside him smiling like she had just inherited a kingdom. The grand hall glittered beneath 3 crystal chandeliers, each one throwing warm gold over marble floors polished so perfectly they reflected every face in the room. Men in tailored black suits stood along the walls, silent and watchful. Women in silk dresses whispered behind champagne glasses. Outside, Chicago's winter pressed against the tall windows, frosting the edges white, but inside the mansion, everything smelled of roses, expensive cologne, and secrets that had been sprayed with perfume so no one would notice the rot underneath. At the center of it all sat Vincent Moretti, the man people once crossed streets to avoid, the man whose name could still a room faster than thunder. He was 38, broad-shouldered, pale-skinned, with dark hair combed back and a face made of hard lines and colder patience. 3 weeks earlier, people said he had been untouchable. Now he sat in a black leather wheelchair near the fireplace, a wool blanket folded neatly over legs that no longer moved, his hands resting still on the chair's arms, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the crowd as though the whole celebration had nothing to do with him. The doctors called it a spinal trauma. The newspapers called it a tragic accident. His fiancée, Madison Blake, called it God's plan, though Grace had heard the way Madison said it when she thought no one important was listening. Softly, sweetly, almost gratefully. That night, Madison wore ivory satin and diamonds at her throat, looking less like a grieving bride-to-be and more like a woman rehearsing for a throne. She moved through the crowd with practiced sadness, touching shoulders, accepting sympathy, lowering her lashes at just the right moments. Every few minutes, she returned to Vincent's side and placed one manicured hand on his shoulder, as if the room needed reminding that he belonged to her now. "Poor Vincent," she murmured, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "He hates being helpless. But I told him he doesn't have to worry anymore. I'll take care of everything." A few people nodded with solemn approval. One older man raised his glass. Someone whispered that Madison was brave. Someone else said Vincent was lucky to have a woman willing to stay. Grace Carter stood behind the serving table with a silver tray balanced in both hands, her black uniform pressed clean, her natural curls pinned low at the nape of her neck. She had learned a long time ago how to be invisible in rich people's houses. Smile only when spoken to. Step aside before being asked. Hear everything, repeat nothing. In the Moretti mansion, invisibility was not just useful. It was survival. She had been hired 8 months ago to clean rooms larger than her entire apartment, change linen softer than anything she owned, and polish floors beneath portraits of men who looked like they had never apologized in their lives. But Grace noticed what invisible people always noticed. The quick glance between Madison and Luca Moretti near the staircase. The way Dr. Samuel Reed avoided Vincent's eyes. The way the house cameras outside the west hallway had gone dark twice since the accident. And now the smile. It happened when Madison turned slightly away from the guests and lifted her champagne flute. For one brief second, the rim of the glass covered her mouth from everyone except Grace. But Grace saw it. A small smile. Not relief. Not love. Victory. Grace's fingers tightened around the tray until the silver edge pressed into her palm. Across the room, Madison leaned down near Vincent's ear and whispered, "Don't look so grim, darling. You still look powerful sitting down." The words were wrapped in sugar, but Grace felt the cruelty underneath them like a draft under a closed door. Vincent did not move. He did not answer. His expression remained carved in stone, his gaze distant, his jaw locked so tightly that a muscle flickered once near his cheek. Most people missed it. Grace did not. She had spent 7 years caring for her father after stroke, 7 years learning the language of bodies that could not always speak. She knew the difference between true numbness and restrained pain. She knew the difference between weakness and someone hiding strength because the wrong person was watching. Then Madison laughed softly, turning back to the room. "He'll need me for everything now." That was when it happened. Beneath the folded blanket, almost hidden in shadow, Vincent's right hand tightened around the armrest of the wheelchair. Not much. Just enough to turn his knuckles white. Just enough for Grace to see the truth begin to breathe. She lowered her eyes before anyone could notice she had been watching, but her heart had already started pounding. The most feared man in Chicago was not as helpless as they believed. And his fiancée had just celebrated too soon. Grace Carter had not always been the kind of woman who could stand still while powerful people smiled over someone else's suffering. Years ago, before the Moretti mansion, before the black uniform and the silent hallways, she had been loud when she needed to be, quick to defend herself, quicker to defend anyone weaker. But life had a way of teaching quiet women how to survive in rooms built to erase them. Her father's stroke had come on a Tuesday morning in a small apartment on the South Side, while Grace was making coffee before her early shift at a rehabilitation clinic. One moment, Elijah Carter was teasing her about burning toast. The next, his right hand could not hold a spoon, and his words fell apart before they reached the air. Doctors spoke in careful sentences after that. Therapy plans. Nerve response, mobility goals, insurance limits. Grace learned all of it because no one else was going to learn it for him. She learned how muscles resisted when they were sleeping and how they trembled when they were trying to wake up. She learned how pride could make a sick man turn his face to the wall rather than let his daughter see him cry. She learned that helplessness was not the same thing as weakness. That lesson followed her into every job she took after her father died. It followed her through hospital bills, rent notices, double shifts, and the morning she walked through the iron gates of the Moretti estate with a borrowed coat and $42 in her checking account. The mansion did not welcome people like Grace. It tolerated them. Its marble floors held the reflections of million-dollar shoes, not worn black sneakers. Its walls carried oil paintings of men with cold eyes and family names that opened doors with a single phone call. Mrs. Evelyn Shaw, the head housekeeper, had explained the rules on Grace's first day without softening a single word. Do not enter private rooms unless assigned. Do not speak to Mr. Moretti unless spoken to. Do not ask about visitors. Do not repeat what you hear. Above all, do not mistake proximity for belonging. Grace had nodded because she understood. Rich houses were full of invisible lines, and crossing one could cost more than a job. For 8 months, she obeyed. She wiped fingerprints from glass doors after midnight meetings. She carried fresh towels past men who stopped talking when she entered. She changed flowers in Madison Blake's dressing room and listened to the woman complain that white roses looked too funeral for an engagement season. Grace noticed the way Madison practiced kindness when mirrors were nearby and dropped it the moment servants turned their backs. She noticed the way Vincent Moretti, before the accident, never raised his voice to staff, never smiled for guests, and never missed anything. He would pass through the hallway in dark suits, 6 feet 2 inches of controlled silence, and the entire house seemed to adjust around him. He frightened people because he did not need to prove he was dangerous. Then came the rainstorm, the shattered schedule, the late-night phone calls, and the morning the mansion woke to find its king returned in a wheelchair. Everyone changed around him. Some became too gentle. Some became too bold. Madison became both. By the night of the gathering, Grace understood one thing clearly. The accident had not weakened the house. It had revealed it. And while everyone else watched the chair, Grace watched the people standing around it. The first crack in the story appeared the morning after Vincent returned from the hospital. The mansion was still half asleep, its long corridors washed in gray daylight, when Grace entered the private sitting room to collect untouched breakfast trays. Vincent had been placed near the tall windows overlooking Lake Michigan, the black wheelchair angled toward the water, the blanket folded over his legs with military precision. Dr. Samuel Reed stood beside him in a navy suit, flipping through a leather folder as though the pages contained nothing more serious than a grocery list. Madison leaned against the fireplace mantel, holding a cup of coffee she had not tasted, her diamond ring catching the pale light every time she moved her hand. There is no meaningful response below the waist, Dr. Reed said, his voice smooth and practiced. The swelling may reduce with time, but I would not encourage false hope. Grace kept her eyes down as she lifted the tray, but the words passed through her like cold water. She had heard doctors use that tone before, the soft professional voice people used when they wanted a family to stop asking questions.
Vincent said nothing.
Madison sighed dramatically and pressed her fingers to her lips. Then we adjust, she said. Vincent has always been strong. Now he will have to let others be strong for him. It sounded kind. It was not. Grace saw Luca Moretti standing near the doorway, one hand in his pocket, his face arranged into concern that never quite reached his eyes. When Dr. Reed crouched to check Vincent's foot, Grace slowed just enough to watch from the corner of her vision. The doctor ran a small metal tool along the sole. Vincent's expression did not change, but his fingers flexed once against the armrest. A tiny movement, a controlled movement, the kind a proud man would bury if he did not want the wrong person to know he felt anything. Dr. Reed saw it too. Grace was sure of that because his hand paused for half a second before he closed the folder and stood. No response, he announced. Madison exhaled, almost too quickly. Luca looked at the floor. Vincent turned his face toward the window. Grace carried the tray out with her pulse beating hard in her throat. Later that day, while replacing towels in the second-floor guest bath, she saw Madison slip into Vincent's private office. That room had been locked since the accident. No staff entered without permission. Grace was about to turn away when she heard the soft scrape of the silver key tray from the desk inside. A minute later, Madison emerged holding a small envelope and Vincent's car keys, the same black keys with the Moretti crest that had been missing from the hall table the night before the crash. Grace froze near the linen closet. Madison looked up and caught her standing there. For one breath, neither woman moved. Then Madison smiled, bright and sharp as polished glass. "Grace," she said, as if they were old friends. "You have such quiet feet. That can be a gift or a problem, depending on where they take you." Grace lowered her eyes. "I was changing the towels, ma'am." Madison stepped closer, perfume blooming in the narrow hallway, sweet enough to hide something bitter.
"Good.
Then keep doing what you were paid to do. Towels, floors, laundry, not thoughts." She walked away before Grace could answer, the envelope tucked beneath her arm. That night, Grace passed the garage on her way to take out the kitchen trash. Rain tapped lightly against the driveway, the same thin rain that had fallen the night of the accident. Through the side window, she saw Vincent's damaged car covered beneath a gray tarp. One corner had come loose, revealing the driver's side door and a long scratch near the lock, too neat to look like damage from the crash. Grace stood there with the trash bag in her hand, staring at that mark until the security light clicked on above her. She stepped back into shadow. The house wanted everyone to believe what it had been told. A tragic road, a broken body, a devoted fiancé. But Grace had seen enough suffering to know when pain was real, and enough lies to know when sympathy was wearing makeup. Something had happened before that car ever left the driveway. And somewhere behind Vincent Moretti's silence, the truth was still awake. By the end of the first week, Madison stopped pretending grief was heavier than control. She moved through the mansion as if the marble floors had already accepted her footsteps as their new command, changing flower arrangements, canceling meetings, approving menus, and speaking to men twice her age with a softness that made every order sound like a favor. Vincent watched from his wheelchair and said almost nothing. That silence frightened Grace more than anger would have. Anger made noise. Silence made plans. The humiliation began at dinner, in the formal dining room where 20 guests sat beneath a ceiling painted with angels who looked down on the Moretti family as if even heaven was afraid to interrupt. Vincent had not wanted a public meal, but Madison insisted it would show strength. "People need to see you," she told him, fastening his cufflinks while Grace stood nearby with a folded napkin. "They need to see that life goes on." What she meant was that people needed to see him seated, dependent, reduced to an object she could arrange beside the silverware. At 8 o'clock sharp, Grace and 2 other staff members carried out the first course. Tomato basil soup in white porcelain bowls. Warm bread. Imported olive oil. Simple food made expensive by the room around it. Vincent sat at the head of the table, his wheelchair positioned where his carved oak chair had once stood. The empty chair had been removed before dinner. Grace noticed that. Vincent noticed it too. His eyes moved once to the empty space beside the wall, then back to Madison. She took her seat at his right hand, smiling at their guests. Vincent is still adjusting, she said, her voice gentle enough to fool anyone who wanted to be fooled. So, I hope everyone will be patient with us.
Us.
The word landed softly and stole loudly. Grace stepped forward to place Vincent's bowl before him, but Madison lifted one hand.
No, gracias.
I will do it. The room quieted with polite interest. Madison picked up the spoon, dipped it into the soup, and raised it toward Vincent's mouth. For one frozen second, no one breathed. Vincent's jaw tightened. Grace felt her own stomach twist. He was not a child. He was not helpless in the way Madison wanted him to be helpless. But the guests watched, and Madison's smile sharpened behind her tenderness. Come on, darling, she murmured. Do not be stubborn. You need to eat. A few people glanced away, embarrassed but unwilling to interfere. Luca Moretti covered a smile. With his wine glass, Vincent looked at Madison's hand, then at her face. Slowly, with a control that seemed almost painful, he opened his mouth and accepted the spoon. Madison beamed as if she had performed an act of love. See, she said lightly. You still look powerful sitting down. A small laugh escaped from somewhere near the middle of the table. Then another. Not loud. Not cruel enough for anyone to confess to it later. Just enough to cut. Grace stood behind Vincent's chair, her hands folded in front of her, her nails pressing crescents into her palms. She had seen men lose jobs, women lose homes, children lose parents, but there was a special kind of ugliness in watching someone take a proud person's pain and turn it into entertainment. Madison dabbed the corner of Vincent's mouth with a napkin he had not asked for. There, she whispered. Better. His face remained still. But under the table, beneath the folded blanket, Grace saw his left hand move. Not toward Madison, not toward the soup, toward the armrest, gripping it so hard the leather creaked. Madison leaned back, satisfied with the little theater she had created. I keep telling him, she said to the guests, this might be good for him. Vincent was always carrying the whole world alone. Maybe now he can finally learn to trust me. The words floated over the table like candle smoke. Grace lowered her eyes before anyone could catch the anger in them. Trust was not what Madison wanted. Trust did not require witnesses. Trust did not smile when a man was made smaller in front of his own house. Across the room, Mrs. Evelyn Shaw stood near the service door, her lined face unreadable, but her hands had gone still around the wine decanter. Even she knew the dinner had crossed into something colder than bad manners. When Grace stepped closer to refill Vincent's water, Madison's eyes snapped to her. Careful, she said, loud enough for the guests to hear. Mr. Moretti has had enough accidents around people who are not paying attention. The insult struck the air cleanly. Grace paused. Every face turned toward her. For a moment, she was no longer invisible. She was just a black maid standing under a chandelier, blamed without being named, expected to swallow the shame like part of the job. She set the pitcher down with steady hands. Yes, ma'am, she said. Her voice did not shake. Vincent's eyes lifted to her then, dark and unreadable. In that look, Grace saw anger, pain, and something else buried deeper. Recognition. Madison smiled again, thinking she had won the room. But she had only shown Grace exactly who she was. And once Grace Carter saw the truth of a person, she did not forget it. That night, long after the guests had gone and the mansion settled into its expensive silence, Grace found the first piece of proof sitting beside Vincent's untouched glass of water. The private recovery room had been built from what used to be a sunroom, all tall windows, cream walls, and polished hardwood floors that smelled faintly of lemon oil. Physical therapy equipment lined one side in careful order. Parallel bars, resistance bands, a padded table, and a standing frame no one seemed eager for Vincent to use. Grace entered quietly with fresh towels over one arm and a silver pitcher of ice water in her hand. She expected the room to be empty. Instead, Vincent sat near the windows in his wheelchair, still dressed in the black shirt he had worn to dinner, sleeves rolled to his forearms, his face turned toward the dark glass, where his reflection stared back at him like a stranger. On the small table beside him sat a white pill cup, a folded napkin, and the half-full glass Madison had brought him before leaving for the night. Grace stopped at the doorway. "I can come back, sir." "Finish your work," Vincent said without looking at her. His voice was low, rough at the edges, but clear. Not the voice of a man defeated. The voice of a man counting every sound in the room. Grace moved carefully, stacking towels in the cabinet, replacing the empty water bottle, wiping the wooden rail of the standing frame. She tried not to look at the glass. She failed. Something cloudy clung to the bottom, faint as chalk dust. When she passed close enough, a bitter medicinal smell rose beneath the clean scent of ice and lemon. Her hand stilled. Years of caring for her father had made her familiar with the quiet language of medication: pain medicine, muscle relaxers, sleep aids, anti-inflammatory tablets, the ordinary chemistry of recovery. This smelled wrong. Too heavy. Too sharp. Too much like the sedatives her father had once been given after surgery, the kind that made his body loose and his thoughts slow. "Do not touch it," Vincent said. Grace froze. His eyes had shifted to her in the window's reflection. "I was only clearing the table." "No," he said. "You were noticing." The words landed between them like a door unlocking. Grace turned slowly. "Sir, that medicine is not for pain." For the first time since she had entered the room, Vincent looked directly at her. There was no surprise in his face.
No confusión.
Only a dangerous stillness, as if he had been waiting to see whether she would be brave enough to say it aloud. "What makes you think that?" he asked. Grace swallowed. This was the line Mrs. Shaw had warned her about on her first day. Do not mistake proximity for belonging. Do not ask questions. Do not have thoughts. But she thought of Madison lifting the spoon at dinner. She thought of Dr. Reed announcing no response while Vincent's fingers betrayed him. She thought of the scratch on the car door, the missing keys, the envelope, the smile behind the champagne glass. "Because I know what recovery looks like," Grace said quietly. "And I know what it looks like when someone is being kept weaker than they should be." The room went still. Outside the windows, the lake was a sheet of black glass. Vincent's hand tightened on the armrest, but this time he did not hide it. "You took care of someone," he said. It was not a question. "My father," Grace answered. 7 years after a stroke. He had days when his legs would not move, and days when they tried before he was ready. "Your body is not dead, Mr. Moretti. It is fighting through something." His eyes held hers, hard enough to frighten most people, but Grace had sat beside hospital beds at 3 in the morning and learned that fear could not be allowed to make decisions. "And the medicine?" he asked. "It could make you tired, slow your reflexes, make therapy harder, maybe even make." Everyone believed the doctor is right. Vincent looked back at the glass. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then, with a control that seemed to cost him pain, he lifted his right foot beneath the blanket. Not far, not strong, just enough for the fabric to shift. Grace's breath caught, but she did not step back. He lowered it again, jaw clenched, a thin sheen of sweat appearing near his temple. "I can feel more than they think," he said. "Not enough. Not yet. But enough to know someone in this house is lying." Grace glanced toward the door. "Then why let them?" Vincent's mouth curved, but there was no humor in it. "Because liars get careless when they believe they have already won." At that moment, footsteps sounded faintly in the hallway. Grace reached for the towel stack, moving by instinct. Vincent became still again, stone-faced, unreadable. The door opened just wide enough for Madison's voice to drift in, sweet and polished. "Everything all right in here?" Grace kept her eyes lowered. Vincent did not blink. "Perfect," he said. Madison remained in the doorway for only a moment, but the air changed around her as if the room itself knew how to hold its breath. She looked from Vincent to Grace, then to the glass on the small table, her smile never slipping, only tightening at the edges. "It is late," she said. "Grace should be in the staff quarters, and you should be resting." Vincent did not turn his chair. Grace was doing her job. "Of course," Madison replied, with a sweetness so polished it could cut. She is very devoted to her little duties. Grace folded the last towel and placed it on the shelf with steady hands. The old version of her, the tired daughter who had sat beside hospital beds and argued with insurance offices until her voice went hoarse, wanted to answer. But the woman standing in the Moretti recovery room knew silence could be sharper than defense. She lowered her eyes. "Good night, ma'am." Madison stepped aside just enough to let her pass, perfume and champagne clinging to the air. As Grace crossed the threshold, Madison leaned closer and whispered, "Careful where your kindness takes you." Grace did not stop walking. Down the corridor, past the oil paintings and the sleeping security cameras, her heart beat hard, but her steps stayed quiet. She knew now that Vincent was not simply recovering. He was hiding. And if Madison suspected Grace had seen too much, the danger would not come loudly. It would come dressed as concern, wrapped in rules, signed by someone with money. The next morning, Mrs. Evelyn Shaw found Grace polishing the banister near the east staircase. The older woman said nothing at first, only ran one finger along the rail and examined it for dust that was not there. "Miss Blake asked that you be reassigned to laundry for the rest of the week," she said at last. Grace kept her cloth moving. "Did she say why?" "She said you seem tired." Mrs. Shaw's voice gave nothing away. "And tired help makes mistakes." Grace looked up then. Mrs. Shaw's face remained stern, but her eyes were not unkind. "Some rooms in this house are safer to clean than others," the older woman added quietly. "And some truths are heavier than a woman should carry alone." Before Grace could answer, Mrs. Shaw walked away, leaving the warning behind like a folded note. That afternoon, Grace was kept below stairs, washing linens, sorting napkins, folding white sheets under fluorescent lights, while the mansion above her prepared for another performance. Madison had announced a small recovery reception for the following night, claiming Vincent needed encouragement from family and close associates. But in the kitchen, Grace heard the real purpose in fragments. Legal papers, temporary authority, medical incapacity, signatures. Luca's name floated through the conversations like oil on water. By midnight, Grace could no longer stay below. She waited until the last dishwasher cycle ended and the staff hallway emptied, then took the service stairs up to the recovery room with a clean blanket over her arm and a decision burning in her chest. Vincent was awake. Of course he was. The room was dark except for the lamp beside him, throwing a circle of amber light across his face. "You should not be here," he said. "Neither should that medicine." Grace closed the door behind her. For a moment, they looked at each other across the quiet room, a Mafia Boss in a wheelchair and a Black Maid who had been told all her life to stay in her place. Then Vincent reached beneath the blanket and moved his foot again, this time with more effort, more pain, more proof. Grace stepped closer, not with pity, but with purpose. "If you want them to believe you are helpless," she said softly, "then you need someone who knows how to help you get strong without letting them see it." Vincent studied her as though measuring the weight of her courage. "And why would you risk that for me?" Grace thought of Madison's smile, her father's trembling hand, the dinner table laughter, and every quiet person who had ever been made small for someone else's comfort. "Because I know what it looks like when people mistake dignity for weakness," she said. The words settled between them, calm and final. Vincent looked toward the parallel bars on the far side of the room. For the first time since the accident, he did not look like a man trapped in a chair. He looked like a man choosing the exact moment to rise. For the next 4 nights, the Moretti mansion slept above a secret that made no sound except Vincent's breath and the soft scrape of his shoes against hardwood. Grace came after midnight, when the kitchen lights were off, when the last guard had finished his coffee, when Madison's heels no longer clicked across the upper hall. She carried towels or folded blankets as an excuse, but hidden beneath those ordinary things was a discipline no one in that house respected, because no one had ever thought to look for it in her. She knew how to count pain without fearing it. She knew how to watch a knee tremble and decide whether it needed rest or one more second of effort. She knew how to speak to pride without wounding it. The first night, Vincent barely made it from the wheelchair to the parallel bars. His hands gripped the rails until his arms shook, his face pale under the amber lamp, his jaw locked against the kind of pain he would never allow anyone else to witness. Grace stood close but did not crowd him. "Do not rush it," she said. "Your body is not a machine you can threaten into obeying." Vincent gave her a look. That would have silenced most men. That has worked for almost everything else. "Not this," Grace said. "This listens to patience." He almost smiled then, but the expression disappeared before it became anything soft. By the second night, he could stand for 8 seconds. By the third, 13. By the fourth, he took one step between the bars, then another, each one small enough to seem meaningless to the world and large enough to change everything inside that room. Grace never clapped. She never cried. She only nodded once, as if restoring a man's dignity was not a miracle, but a responsibility. That was why Vincent began to trust her. Not because she feared him, not because she served him, because she looked at him without worship and without pity. But while Vincent grew stronger in the dark, Madison grew bolder in the light. She replaced 2 longtime drivers with men who answered to Luca. She moved Vincent's financial folders into her private sitting room. She asked Dr. Reed to prepare a written statement confirming that Vincent would be unable to manage complex family matters for the foreseeable future. Every word sounded medical. Every intention smelled like theft. Grace heard enough while polishing silver outside the breakfast room to understand the shape of the trap. The recovery reception was not about recovery at all. It was a coronation for Madison, wrapped in sympathy and signed in black ink. On the afternoon of the event, Madison found Grace arranging white roses in the grand hall. "Not those," Madison said, pulling one stem from the vase and dropping it onto the table. "White makes everything look like a hospital." Grace reached for the fallen rose. Madison placed one hand over it first, pressing the petals flat beneath her palm. "You know, Grace, Vincent has always had a weakness for loyal employees. He mistakes silence for devotion." Grace lifted her eyes carefully. "Some silence is devotion, ma'am." Madison's smile cooled. "And some silence is just knowing your place." That evening, the mansion filled again with expensive voices. Madison wore pale blue and moved beside Vincent's wheelchair like an actress who knew exactly where the light touched her face. She laughed softly. She accepted praise. She let guests tell her she was strong. Then, as Grace passed with a tray of champagne, Madison shifted her elbow and sent a full glass spilling down the front of Grace's black uniform. The cold liquid soaked through the fabric, and the room paused just long enough for humiliation to do its work. "Oh," Madison said, her hand to her mouth. "That is what happens when help stands too close to power." A few guests looked away. Luca smirked into his drink. Grace stood perfectly still, champagne dripping from the edge of her sleeve onto the marble floor. Vincent's hands tightened on the wheelchair arms, but he did not move. Not yet. Madison leaned closer, her voice sweet enough for the room and sharp enough for Grace. "Clean yourself up before you embarrass the house." Grace lowered her head. "Yes, ma'am." She turned toward the service hall, every eye following her exit. But inside the pocket of her apron, beneath the wet fabric and folded napkins, a small recorder was still running. And Madison Blake had just given the truth a voice. Grace did not leave the service hall to clean herself up. She stepped into the pantry, closed the door behind her, and stood perfectly still in the dark for 3 breaths while champagne cooled against her skin and Madison's words replayed through the tiny recorder in her apron. "Help stands too close to power." Grace looked down at the wet black fabric of her uniform, then reached into the pocket and stopped the device with one careful press. Her hands did not shake. Not anymore. When she returned to the grand hall, the reception had shifted into its final performance. A long mahogany table had been placed near the fireplace, dressed with legal folders, gold pens, and crystal glasses filled with untouched water. Dr. Samuel Reed stood at one end, his face pale under the chandelier light. Luca Moretti stood at the other, pretending impatience was concern. Madison had positioned Vincent's wheelchair in the center of the room, like a symbol she owned. She rested one hand on his shoulder, while speaking to the gathered associates. "This is only temporary," she said, her voice trembling. in exactly the places sympathy required. Vincent needs peace.
Stability.
Someone who can make decisions while he focuses on healing. The words moved through the crowd easily because they had been polished for belief. Grace crossed the room with a fresh tray, damp uniform hidden beneath a clean service jacket Mrs. Shaw had silently handed her at the pantry door. The older woman said nothing, but her eyes had followed Grace as if she already knew the night had become heavier than service. Vincent did not look at Grace when she entered. That was how she knew he had seen her. His face remained blank, his hands still, his body arranged in perfect helplessness. Madison picked up the top document and placed it on the table before him. "It simply allows me to protect what you built," she said, leaning close enough for everyone to witness devotion. "No one will think less of you for trusting me." Vincent stared at the paper. "And if I do not sign?" A quiet ripple passed through the room. Madison smiled with patient sorrow. "Darling, Dr. Reed has already explained your condition. The family cannot remain uncertain because you are proud." Dr. Reed cleared his throat. "Medically speaking, emotional resistance is common after trauma. It would be wise to reduce unnecessary pressure on Mr. Moretti." Grace set her tray down on a sideboard and slipped one hand into her pocket. The recorder felt small there, almost weightless, but the truth inside it had teeth. Madison guided the pen toward Vincent's hand. "Just sign," she whispered, still smiling. "Let me carry the burden now." Her fingers closed around his, as if to help him grip the pen. That was when Vincent's hand moved. Not weakly. Not by accident. His fingers wrapped around Madison's wrist and stopped her cold. The pen froze above the page. Madison's smile vanished so quickly it left her face bare. "Vincent," she breathed. He looked up at her, and for the first time that night, the old silence returned to the mansion, the kind that made powerful men remember they were standing in another man's house. "You should have waited until I was actually broken," he said. Madison tried to pull away, but he released her before she could make it look like force. He placed both hands on the arms of the wheelchair. Grace felt the room stop breathing. Slowly, painfully, Vincent pushed himself forward. His shoulders tightened. His face drained of color. The effort carved itself across his jaw, but he did not stop. One foot touched the marble, then the other. For a long second, he hovered between the chair and the floor, a man suspended between the lie they had built around him and the truth he had hidden beneath it. Grace stepped closer, not to hold him, only to stand where he could see her. Vincent met her eyes. That was enough. He rose. The motion was not smooth. It was not easy. It was better than easy. It was earned. Around the hall, glasses lowered. Conversations died unfinished. Luca's face went slack. Dr. Reed took one step back. Madison stared at Vincent's legs as if they had betrayed her personally. The wheelchair sat empty behind him. Vincent stood in front of the unsigned papers, breathing hard. One hand braced on the table, but upright. Grace pressed play inside her pocket. Madison's own voice filled the room, soft, smug, and unmistakable. Once he signs, he will never know how much of the medicine kept him quiet. A crippled king is easier to control. No one moved. No one even looked away. The chandeliers glittered above them like witnesses. Madison opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Vincent did not raise his voice.
He did not need to.
"Grace," he said quietly. She stepped forward and placed the recorder on the table beside the papers. The room went silent enough to hear the marble remember every footstep that had ever crossed it. The recording ended with a small click that sounded louder than any accusation could have. Madison stood beneath the chandelier with her diamonds bright against her throat and all the color gone from her face. For weeks, she had worn sympathy like a silk dress. Now the dress had torn, and everyone could see what had been stitched underneath. Luca was the first to move, backing away from the table as though distance could erase his part in the plan. Dr. Reed looked down at his shoes, the same polished shoes that had walked through the mansion day after day, carrying false reports and careful lies. Vincent remained standing, one hand braced against the mahogany table, his breathing controlled but heavy. Pain trembled through him, visible only to those who knew how to read it. Grace knew. She saw the strain in his shoulders, the slight bend in his knee, the white pressure of his fingers against the wood. But she also saw something stronger than pain. He had been seated by their deceit. He had risen by his will. Madison finally found her voice. "Vincent, please. You have to understand. I was trying to protect you from yourself." No one believed her. Not even the candles seemed to flicker in her favor. Vincent looked at her for a long moment, and the room learned the difference between anger and judgment. Anger burns hot and fast. Judgment is cold enough to last. "You did not protect me," he said. "You studied my weakness and called it love." Madison reached for him, but Mrs. Evelyn Shaw stepped forward before anyone else moved. The older woman did not touch Madison.
She did not need to.
One look from Mrs. Shaw was enough to remind the room that dignity did not always arrive with a title. "Miss Blake," she said evenly, "your code is waiting in the foyer." Two security men approached quietly. There was no shouting.
No spectacle.
Only the soft sound of Madison's heels against marble as she was escorted past the same guests who had praised her devotion an hour earlier. Luca lowered his eyes when Vincent turned toward him. "Leave this house," Vincent said. "The papers will explain the rest." Luca opened his mouth, then closed it. For once, even betrayal had nothing clever to say. Dr. Reed tried to speak next, but Vincent lifted one hand. "Your license will hear from my attorneys before sunrise." The doctor swallowed and nodded, suddenly smaller than the folder he carried. One by one, the masks left the room. What remained was silence, the kind that comes after a storm when everyone is afraid to touch what has been broken. Vincent's strength finally wavered. Grace stepped forward by instinct, stopping close enough to help but not close enough to embarrass him. He saw the choice she made, and something in his face softened where no one else could see it. "The chair," he said quietly. Grace guided it behind him without a word. He lowered himself slowly, not collapsing, not surrendering, simply respecting the body that had carried him farther than anyone believed it could. The guests watched as Grace adjusted the blanket over his legs, not like a servant covering weakness, but like a woman protecting hard-won dignity. Vincent looked across the room at the unsigned documents, then at the recorder resting beside them. "Everyone leave us," he said. This time, no one hesitated. Within moments, the grand hall emptied until only Vincent, Grace, and Mrs. Shaw remained beneath the fading gold light. Mrs. Shaw gave Grace a small nod and disappeared through the service door. Vincent sat in silence for several seconds. Then he turned his chair toward Grace. "You could have walked away," he said. Grace's hands folded in front of her damp uniform. "I have seen what happens when people look away too long." He studied her, not as staff, not as help, not as someone beneath the family name carved into every wall. He looked at her as if the whole mansion had finally learned where its strength had been hiding. "Grace Carter," he said, his voice low but clear, it did not just help me stand. You reminded this house what it means to be worthy of standing." Her eyes filled, but she did not cry. She had not done it for praise. She had done it because cruelty had smiled in front of her and expected silence. Vincent reached for the recorder and placed it in her hand. The truth belongs to the one brave enough to carry it. Outside, Chicago moved on, unaware that inside a mansion by the lake, power had changed shape. It no longer looked like a man in a dark suit or a woman with a diamond ring. It looked like a Black Maid standing steady in a room that once tried to make her invisible, and a wounded king who had learned that dignity does not come from never falling. It comes from who helps you rise. And that day, the world remembered what dignity looks like.